Have you ever wondered how we became who we are, and what secrets of our past might be lost forever? Tonight, we will explore the hidden threads of human evolution, the vanished ancestors, and the silent mysteries that science still struggles to explain. As you listen, I want to know, where are you joining from, and what time is it where you are? If you're ready to uncover these mysteries and drift into the story of our origins, make sure to subscribe to this channel and join us on this journey. What if we are not who we think we are? It is a question that does not shout, but whispers. It drifts in like a breeze through a forgotten cave, brushing across the stone walls of our imagination. We are told a simple story of ourselves, a neat unfolding, from ape to fire, from fire to tools, from tools to cities, from cities to the present moment where you are listening now. But what if the story is too simple, too clean, too much like a straight road drawn across an uneven land? Nature rarely moves in straight lines. It curls, it erodes, it breaks apart, it hides things in the folds of time. Perhaps human history has done the same. When we look at the fossil record, what we find are not full pages of a book, but torn fragments, scattered across deserts, caves, and seabed. A jawbone here, a footprint there, a piece of skull pressed into stone. The rest is missing. Entire chapters may have been erased by erosion, by water, by volcanic fire, by the slow crushing of tectonic plates dragging the land beneath the oceans. We build timelines from what survives, but what survives is never everything. It is only what luck and circumstance allow. And so the story we tell of ourselves may be just a shadow of the fuller truth. Consider deep time, the endless stretch of Earth's memory. 3 million years ago, hominins walked upright in the grasslands of Africa, leaving behind bones that hardened into fossil. But for every one that fossilized, countless others dissolved back into dust. For every tool we find, countless others were shattered, buried, or melted into silence. Could it be that entire peoples rose and fell without leaving us a single surviving trace? Could it be that human identity is not a straight line of progress, but a web of forgotten attempts, experiments, and vanished paths? The silence of extinction reminds us that nature erases without hesitation. Dinosaurs ruled the earth for nearly 200 million years, and yet what remains of them fits into museums. If such powerful creatures can disappear almost entirely, what of us? Our fragile bones, our wooden shelters, our earliest fires, how much of that is gone forever? What if there were other beings like us, beings who dreamed and carved and told stories, erased so thoroughly by entropy that we no longer remember they existed? Even the ground beneath our feet conspires to forget. Ocean subduction drags ancient coastlines down into the Earth's mantle, recycling stone into magma. The rain wears down mountains, glaciers scrape away valleys, winds scatter dust across deserts. The planet is always changing, and in that change, memory is lost. We think the land is stable, but it is not. It moves, it forgets, it buries. If our own story is written in stone, it is written on pages that crumble in the wind, and yet fragments remain. Fossils with faces that are almost ours, but not quite. Tools too old for the species we think made them. Traces of fire in places where humans were not supposed to exist. Each discovery raises questions that linger like echoes in a canyon. Are we missing something? Is there another branch of our past hidden in the shadows, waiting for us to notice? It is possible that our brains, so sudden and vast, are themselves clues to a mystery we have not solved. Why did they grow so quickly in such a short stretch of evolutionary time? Not because survival demanded it. Our ancestors lived well enough without cities, without language, without painting the walls of caves. Perhaps intelligence is not only a tool for survival, but something else, an inheritance from a source we cannot name. Could it be that the very thing that makes us human is not fully explained by the fossil record at all? And if that is true, then what are we? Memory layered upon memory, with most of the layers missing. Echoes of voices that never made it into the history books. Dust that was once bone, silence that was once song. We carry within us a sense of continuity, of belonging to a long lineage. But that lineage may be more fractured, more incomplete than we dare to imagine. Perhaps the neat story is a comfort we give ourselves, a way to quiet the unease of not knowing. But the unease remains. It stirs when we look at a skull that seems both human and not human. It rises when we walk along the shore and realize that entire coastlines, entire civilizations may be drowned beneath the waves. It lingers when we stare at the stars and wonder if intelligence is a rare accident or a pattern that keeps repeating even here on Earth. Maybe, maybe not. The questions return like tides, never fully answered, always pulling us deeper. And so we are left with the whisper, what if we are not who we think we are? What if our true story is not yet told? The fossils, the rocks, the silence, all suggest that identity is not a single line, but a tapestry with most of its threads missing. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The fossil record is not a book written in full sentences, but a collection of shadows. It does not speak clearly, but whispers through fragments. A tooth buried in sandstone, a tibia lifted from the silt of an ancient river, a skull pressed into volcanic ash. These are the faint silhouettes of lives once lived, but they are not the lives themselves. They are only shadows. When we look into those shadows, we want to see ourselves, to find continuity, to trace a clean thread back to a beginning. But what the fossil record gives us is jagged and incomplete, like a photograph burned at the edges. We fill in the missing pieces with imagination, with theory, with the stories that feel most logical. And yet, logic does not always align with truth. Could it be that the fragments we hold are misleading, not because they lie, but because they are so terribly incomplete? Geology does not care for memory. Time is an ocean that erodes, shifts, buries, and erases. Fossils survive only under the rarest conditions, when bone is quickly covered, when minerals seep in to replace its structure, when entropy spares a fragment from decay. For every fossil we find, there may be millions of bodies lost to dust. Entire lineages could rise and fall without leaving behind a single preserved trace. It is unsettling and humbling to think that the human story we reconstruct is not simply partial. It may be little more than the shadow of a shadow. Consider this: in Africa's Olduvai Gorge, Tools were found older than the species we once believed made them. In Indonesia, bones of a small-bodied human-like being, Homo floresiensis, were discovered. Beings who lived until surprisingly recently, beings we never knew existed until their shadows surfaced. In Siberia, a fragment of finger bone revealed an entirely new branch of humanity, the Denisovans, known until the last decade. If these beings can vanish so fully that only a few bones betray their existence, then what else might still be hidden in the Earth's layers? How many names, how many faces have already dissolved back into silence? And then there are the absences, the long gaps in the record where we expect transition but find only sudden change. The leap from primitive stone tools to complex carvings, the sudden emergence of cave paintings that show not just animals but imagination, abstraction, and spirit. Evolutionary steps that should feel gradual instead appear abrupt, as though pages have been torn out of the book of time. Could it be that those pages once contained entire forgotten species, or even civilizations, erased so cleanly that we no longer know they were there? Science, careful and cautious, warns us not to fill the gaps with speculation. But speculation is human, as natural as breathing. We wonder because we cannot help but wonder. We look into the shadows and imagine faces, voices, cultures that might have risen and fallen long before our textbooks begin. Maybe, maybe not. But the questions remain, lingering like a faint echo in a canyon, refusing to fade. Even isotopes carry shadows of memory. In the chemistry of old bones, in the oxygen trapped within ancient shells, in the carbon buried in sediments, there are traces of climate shifts, diets, migrations, yet even here the data is not complete. It is like listening to a song with most of the notes missing, trying to reconstruct the melody from fragments of sound. Could it be that the truth of who we are is written not in the clear light of evidence, but in the faint outline of what is absent? There is a kind of beauty in this incompleteness. The fossil record does not give us certainty, but it invites us to imagine, to lean into the mystery, to understand that we are not simply the product of what survived, but also of what was lost. We are creatures shaped not just by continuity, but by forgetting, by absence, by silence, and yet the shadows themselves are enough to unsettle us. If fossils can appear out of nowhere, rewriting everything we thought we knew, then perhaps the next fragment will change the story again. Perhaps beneath the dust of deserts or beneath the floor of oceans lie bones that do not fit our categories, bones that whisper of versions of humanity we have not yet named. And so, as we stare into the incomplete fossil record, we are left with the same quiet question. If these shadows are all that remain, what larger shapes once cast them? And if shadows can mislead, what happens when the shadows themselves do not belong? And if shadows can mislead, what happens when the shadows themselves do not belong? In museums and research papers, there are fossils that seem to fit uneasily into the story we have written for ourselves. Bones too old to be that human, yet too human to be that old. Skulls with shapes that do not align neatly with the expected timeline. Remains that raise eyebrows, then questions, then debates that ripple through the scientific world. These are the bones that do not belong. It is tempting to dismiss them, to say they are anomalies, misdated, or misunderstood, Science demands caution, and rightly so. Yet caution does not erase the fact that these fragments exist. A jawbone from Greece that appears older than it should be. A skull from China with a strange blend of archaic and modern traits. The skeleton of a child in Africa whose features look both like ours and like something entirely different. Each discovery unsettles the idea of a single straight path of evolution. Each one whispers of hidden branches, of stories that have not been told. Geology complicates this even further. Bones travel, earthquakes shift layers, floods move remains from one age to another. The planet itself does not keep perfect order, and so we are left with puzzles, with pieces that seem to be in the wrong box. Could it be that some of these bones truly belong to lineages we have not named, cousins of humanity erased so thoroughly that only fragments remain? Or could it be that our own timeline is more tangled than we can yet imagine? Not a single road, but many paths crossing, merging, vanishing. The mystery deepens when we remember how fragile bone is. It does not want to survive. It wants to crumble, to return to dust. Fossils are miracles of preservation, rare exceptions to the rule of decay. And yet, even within those rare exceptions, we sometimes find bones that carry an unsettling familiarity, features of the brow, the jaw, the skull, vault that look like echoes of us, but belonging to beings who should not yet have existed. Could it be that humans, or human-like beings, walked the earth earlier than we believe? Or that different versions of us overlapped, sharing landscapes, sharing firelight, even sharing blood? DNA, when it can be recovered, has begun to confirm what once seemed like speculation. Neanderthals live within us still, woven into our genes. Denisovans discovered from a single finger bone turned out to have left entire legacies in the people of Asia and Oceania. What if more lineages are hidden, their bones misfiled in museum drawers, their existence erased except for faint whispers in our blood? Could it be that the bones that do not belong are not mistakes at all, but clues pointing toward forgotten kin? And yet, there is another possibility. Some of these bones might belong not to entirely different species, but to humans, like Usumans, whose cultures, whose lives, simply did not survive the erosion of time. A misplaced skeleton might not be the trace of an alien branch of evolution, but the remains of an early traveler, a wanderer who ventured where humans were not supposed to be. If so, then perhaps our ancestors spread across the earth far earlier than we think, rewriting the story of migration and memory. There is a haunting beauty in these misfits. They remind us that the earth does not give up its secrets easily, that identity, even biological identity, is not fixed but fluid. We want categories: Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, but the bones that do not belong resist categories. They blur the boundaries. They force us to wonder if identity itself, power, identity is more fragile, more shifting than we realize. And so we are left with quiet questions, carried gently on the current of deep time. What if our family tree is not a tree at all, but a forest full of branches that overlap, twist, and disappear into mist? What if the bones that seem out of place are not mistakes, but fragments of forgotten lives? And if such fragments still lie buried beneath deserts, forests, and oceans, waiting to be uncovered, what stories will they tell us when they finally rise to the surface? For every bone that fits the timeline, there is another that does not. For every neat answer, another question. And if bones can refuse to belong, then perhaps the story itself is not fixed. Perhaps it is still being written, even now, and yet. If even bones can mislead us, what are we to make of the greater silence that surrounds them, the silence of ages, when nothing at all seems to remain? And yet. If even bones can mislead us, what are we to make of the greater silence that surrounds them, the silence of ages, when nothing at all seems to remain? Deep time is vast beyond comprehension, stretching not for centuries or millennia, but for millions upon millions of years. It is a scale so immense that our own history feels like a single breath, a flicker of a candle in the dark. Within that silence, most of the story of life is hidden from us. When we look into deep time, we find ourselves staring into absence. We see a few scattered fossils, a handful of artifacts, the faintest traces of climate shifts recorded in the chemistry of ice or stone. But these are only fragments, tiny markers, scattered across a horizon that extends further than imagination. Between each marker lie oceans of silence, millions of years with no record at all. What happened there? Who lived and died in those lost spans of time? Geology teaches us that the earth is restless. Layers of rock are folded, overturned, buried, and erased. Mountains rise, then crumble. Oceans spread across continents, then retreat. Entire landscapes are swallowed and reborn. In this constant cycle of destruction and renewal, memory is fragile. Fossils that might have told us stories are ground into dust, melted into magma, or drowned beneath sediments. Deep time does not preserve, willingly erases more than it remembers. Entropy, too, is always at work. Nothing resists decay forever. Bones turn to powder, wood to ash, cities to rubble. Even the most enduring structures, pyramids, temples, monuments, are temporary in the face of deep time. 100,000 years from now, what will remain of us? 1,000,000 years, 10 million, perhaps only a few scattered shadows, just as we hold now from those who came before. Could it be that deep time holds not just forgotten species, but forgotten civilizations, erased so thoroughly that not even their ruins remain? Silence is not empty, though it is full of possibility. In the spaces between fossils, we can imagine other experiments of nature, other versions of humanity, other branches of the tree of life that flourished briefly and then vanished. Maybe they left no trace because none survived. Or maybe the traces are still there, buried in layers we have not yet reached, drowned beneath seas we have not yet explored. Silence invites us to wonder. Silence demands it, and yet there are faint voices in that silence. Isotopes in ancient ice cores tell us of climates long past, of ages of warmth and cold, of extinctions and renewals. Strata of rock reveal the fingerprints of cataclysm, volcanic eruptions, asteroid strikes, sudden shifts that altered the course of life. Within those signals, we see glimpses of the forces that shaped us, the silent backdrop against which evolution unfolded. But these voices do not tell us everything. They only suggest, hint, whisper. The greater part of the story is still untold. It is humbling to realize that the earth has lived so many lives without us. For 4.5 billion years, worlds have come and gone, on this same planet oceans, forming and disappearing continents, drifting, climates shifting, species rising and falling. Our own story is only a recent addition, written on the thinnest upper layer of the Earth's crust. Could it be that we are not the first to wonder, not the first to build, not the first to vanish into the silence of deep time? Perhaps this is why silence feels so heavy when we think about it, not because it is empty, but because it might be full, full of erasures, full of forgotten beings, full of histories that will never return. When we hold a fossil in our hand, it is a rare survivor from that silence. But for every fossil that survives, how many countless others have been erased? The thought is dizzying, almost unbearable, and yet it pulls us deeper. We tell ourselves that we know who we are, where we came from, how the story began. But deep time reminds us that certainty is an illusion. The silence is larger than the fragments we hold. The silence is the rule, the fossils the exception. And if so much can vanish, then perhaps the most important parts of our story have already slipped away. Perhaps we are only piecing together the edges of something far greater, and so we listen to the silence, straining for echoes, searching for meaning in the spaces between. What does it conceal? What has it already taken from us? And if deep time can erase so completely, then how can we trust the fragments that remain, the bones, the shadows, the traces that sometimes do not belong? The earth has always been both cradle and executioner. For every lush forest that offered shelter, for every fertile valley that nourished our ancestors, there were moments when the world itself seemed to conspire against life, cleansing it in fire, drowning it in flood, burying it beneath choking ash. Extinction is not an anomaly in Earth's history, is the rhythm by which nature resets her stage, clearing the canvas for new forms to rise. Humanity, fragile and unassuming in its infancy, was shaped as much by catastrophe as by evolution. Imagine standing on the edge of a volcanic plain in East Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. The ground trembles beneath your feet, a warning that something immense stirs below. In an instant, the air darkens, a towering column of ash climbing into the stratosphere, blotting out the sun. Within hours, forests are suffocated, rivers choked, animals driven to madness as fire consumes their world. For the small bands of early humans scattered across this land, survival becomes a game of impossible odds. Food disappears, the skies weep poison, and silence descends where once the earth rang with the cries of life. Scientists studying ancient layers of ash and soot find more than destruction. They find the fingerprints of destiny. Massive eruptions, like Toba in Indonesia, some 74,000 years ago, may have pushed humanity to the brink. Genetic evidence hints that our population could have shrunk to just a few thousand, breeding individuals razor's edge from extinction. Had the ash settled heavier, had the climate stayed colder longer, perhaps we would not be here to remember. In the story of our species, survival was never guaranteed. It was a coin toss, and yet catastrophe has a strange gift. What survives is changed, hardened, sharpened. The bands of humans who endured famine and fire did so not because they were the strongest in body, but because they adapted, because they remembered. They carried with them not only scars of hunger, but also stories, oral traditions whispered around fragile fires, myths of darkness and light, tales of wrathful gods and reborn worlds. Beneath these stories lay memory encoded, not in genes, but in culture, in the invisible inheritance that passes from one generation to the next. Extinction, then, was not only a force that erased it, was a teacher. The fall of great beasts, like the mammoths and saber-toothed cats, was not merely tragedy, it was also opportunity. Their absence carved open ecological niches that humans would step into, reshaping landscapes with fire, with tools, with imagination. And each time the earth burned, each time rivers swelled and plains emptied of life, we learned something more about our precarious place in the cosmos. The silence after fire is not emptiness, it is a threshold. In that silence, new beginnings take root. When we trace the shadowed path of human evolution, we do not only see bones and artifacts, we see the echoes of worlds that ended, and the resilience of those who carried the flame of life through the ash. Without cataclysm, there would be no us. We are not just children of flesh and blood. We are children of fire, of memory, and of extinction's harsh hand. Our brains are mysteries within mysteries, a strange architecture of thought rising inside. The quiet of bone, a cathedral of folded tissue that whispers with electricity and yet feels like the seat of dreams. Why did they grow so large, so quickly, in ways no other species on this planet could mirror? Evolutionary logic gives us fragments of the answer, but never the whole design. Never the map of how this leap unfolded, never the deeper reason why it should happen at all. For millions of years, life on Earth sculpted itself with muscle, with claw, with wing, with shell. But here, within us, nature built something else, a soft engine of imagination that weighs almost nothing and yet remakes the world again and again. When we look back through the fossil record, skulls become clues, the shape of the cranium swelling. Over time, the forehead rising like a cliff, the vault expanding until it could house the storm of neurons that define us. A brain 3 times the size of our ancestors appeared in the span of just 2 million years, a blink compared to the long patience of geological ages. Some say it was fire that unlocked this growth, the cooking of food that released more energy, feeding the hungry organ that devours 1/5 of our body's power. Others say it was language, the need to hold stories in the mouth and carry them across generations like invisible heirlooms. Still others wonder if it was the endless complexity of social life, the constant chessboard of alliances and betrayals, of caring and competing, that forced our minds to stretch further and further, always keeping pace with the hidden thoughts of others. But perhaps it is not only survival that shapes a brain. Perhaps it is also curiosity, the restless gaze toward horizons, the ache to know what lies beyond the hill, beyond the sea, beyond the stars. No other species paints on cave walls or buries its dead with flowers, or builds instruments to capture the faint pulse of distant galaxies. Our brains are not just tools, they are questions made flesh, the very embodiment of wonder, searching for itself in the dark. And yet, this leap remains puzzling. Why here, and why now? The Earth has carried countless creatures with nervous systems, the octopus with its alien intelligence, the crow with its craft of tools, the dolphin with its layered songs. Their brilliance is undeniable, their awareness shimmering in ways we are only beginning to glimpse. But still, none of them crossed into the same vast expansion we did. Could it be accident, a genetic spark caught at the right moment? Could it be necessity, a climate shifting, forcing adaptation through thought rather than tooth or claw? Or could it be something deeper, something like the universe asking itself to awaken, using us as its mirror? Inside the skull, the brain is not smooth but folded, valleys and ridges increasing the surface. Like a crumpled landscape compressed into the space of two fists. Within those folds, signals pass, tiny sparks of sodium and potassium ions flowing across membranes like tides in miniature. Billions of neurons whisper to one another, and within their whisper emerges memory, perception, emotion. A thought is not a single place, but a storm moving through this network, patterns weaving and dissolving like constellations across a night sky. And yet, when we try to capture it, to pin down exactly how thought becomes self, how matter becomes awareness, it slips away. As if consciousness is not something the brain contains, but something it channels, like a radio tuned to a frequency too subtle to measure. Philosophers have long wondered, is the brain the source of mind, or merely its vessel? Is memory a product of chemical traces, or are those chemicals simply the footprints of something more elusive? We know the brain decays. We know neurons die, tangling into plaques, dissolving into silence. We know identity can fracture with injury, with illness, with time. And yet the question lingers. Thought can vanish. What was it made of in the first place? Is it possible that consciousness is not a possession, but a brief alignment, a resonance between body and cosmos? As temporary and fragile as a song in the wind. The puzzle of the brain is not only about what it is, but also about what it remembers and what it forgets. Each of us carries stories etched into circuits, childhood mornings, the sound of rain, the face of someone we loved and lost, and slowly, inexorably, those memories fade. Perhaps this too is part of the design, that forgetting is as essential as remembering, that the mind must be porous so that it can keep moving, keep dreaming, keep making space for new wonders. And as we drift in this mystery, one cannot help but ask, if the brain itself is a question, then what questions does it still hold that we have not yet learned to hear? What thoughts are waiting at the edge of perception, unformed but shimmering, like stars below the horizon? Could it be that the next leap, the next expansion lies not in matter, but in awareness itself? And yet, if this much can be gained, and this much can be forgotten, what else within us waits to be uncovered? And yet, if this much can be gained, and this much can be forgotten, what else within us waits to be uncovered? Perhaps the answer lies not only in our minds, but in the objects that remain long after memory has vanished, the quiet stones that refuse to decay, the artifacts that outlive the flesh that shaped them. Archaeologists kneel in the dust of old riverbeds and dry lake plains, brushing away grains of time to reveal tool shards of rock, split and sharpened, edges worn smooth by hands long dissolved into the soil. Some of these tools are older than we are, older than the species said to have made them. They sit in silence, defying timelines, as if whispering that intelligence does not belong solely to us. As if the mind's awakening began before the name human was ever spoken. Consider the Aquilan hand axe, a teardrop of stone found scattered across Africa and beyond. its form repeating for more than 1,000,000 years, each copy echoing the memory of the last. It is not the mark of accident, but of tradition, a continuity stretching across hundreds of generations who never knew one another, yet shared the same gesture, the same rhythm of strike against flint. To hold such a tool is to feel the echo of forgotten hands guiding your grip, hands that belonged not to Homo sapiens, but to ancestors more shadowed, species whose names sound half-arrest: Homo erectus, Homo habilis, beings whose minds were both like ours and unlike ours, minds we can never fully enter, but can only imagine through what they left behind. The puzzle deepens when the tools appear older than the makers we thought responsible. In layers of sediment dated by isotopes and volcanic ash, in river terraces carved by ancient floods, stone flakes have been found that predate the earliest known humans by hundreds of thousands of years. Could it be that intelligence bloomed earlier, in forms we scarcely recognize, in lineages we believed simple or incapable? Or did forgotten species, cousins lost to time, experiment with stone long before we arrived, only to be erased by extinction, their stories written in nothing but the scars left on rock? Science offers fragments of explanation. Geological layers can shift, artifacts can be displaced by water. The dating of strata can blur across fault lines and subductions. But sometimes, even after careful cross-checking, the mystery remains. A tool shaped where no human should have been. A mark cut where no hand is remembered. In these gaps, speculation lingers. Not because evidence is certain, but because absence itself invites wonder. And what truly is a tool? A flake of stone is not alive, not conscious, yet it carries intention, an imprint of mind pressed into matter. When archaeologists lift one from the soil, they are holding not only an object, but a thought preserved across deep time. A thought that may belong to us, or may belong to something that came before us. Perhaps intelligence is not a sudden leap, but a long awakening, unfolding in stages. With sparks of awareness glimmering in species we can no longer see, we tend to imagine ourselves as the first to dream, the first to wonder, the first to reshape the world. But maybe not. Maybe the urge to shape stone was born long before memory, a rhythm practiced again and again by beings who lived and vanished, their voices silent but their gestures still visible in the sharpness of a blade. Could it be that intelligence is not owned by us but borrowed, a current moving through the long river of life, touching one branch, then another, flowing onward toward whatever lies ahead? There is humility in stone. Fossils carry the record of bone and shell, but tools carry the record of mind, of thought made tangible. When we see them, we are forced to wonder not only who made them, but why. Was it survival alone, the carving of meat, the cutting of hide, the digging of roots? Or was there something more, something quieter, an early flicker of curiosity, of play, of experimenting with the possible? A hand axe may seem simple, but within its symmetry lies a kind of beauty, a sense of form beyond function, as if the maker sought not just utility, but expression, not just survival, but meaning. These stones remind us that we are not the beginning of intelligence, nor perhaps its culmination. We are simply one chapter in a book written across epochs, a book whose earlier pages are tattered, half erased, barely legible. What if whole civilizations rose and fell in miniature before ours, so small and so fleeting they left behind nothing but the faint trace of chipped rock? What if intelligence does not climb in a straight line but flickers, appears, vanishes, returns? And so the puzzle lingers, nestled in the silence of the earth. Tools older than we are, thoughts older than we remember. The stones do not explain themselves. They only wait, patient, unchanging, until we bend low to notice them again. And when we do, we cannot help but ask, if forgotten hands once carved the first tools, what else might have been carved, and what else might we have already lost? Asterisk. And if forgotten hands once carved the first tools, what else might have been carved, and what else might we have already lost? Perhaps the ocean holds the answer, though its answers are not spoken but drowned, sealed away in the silence beneath its tides. For as long as there has been land, there has been sea, rising and falling in slow rhythms, advancing with patience, retreating with grace, swallowing coastlines, remaking shorelines, erasing the memory of what once stood there. Sea levels have never been fixed, never permanent. They breathe with the pulse of ice and heat, glaciers forming and melting, continents bending under the weight of frozen epochs. And with each rise, with each retreat, whole landscapes vanish, entire worlds sink into the salt. If we look back through the deep record of geology, we see this breathing written into stone. Ancient shorelines fossilized on cliffs, terraces carved, where waves once broke, coral reefs now stranded far inland. During the ice ages, oceans retreated so far that what is now seabed was once dry land, vast plains where rivers wandered and herds of animals crossed. The Bering Land Bridge stretched between Asia and North America, a wide expanse of tundra where humans once walked into new worlds. Doggerland lay between Britain and Europe, a fertile, forested region, home to hunters and families, a landscape now buried beneath the North Sea. These places are not myths, they are forgotten geographies, drowned under water, that returned when the ice melted, leaving only faint traces, flint tools pulled from fishing nets, mammoth bones dredged from the sand, echoes of footsteps lost to the tide. But for every Doggerland we have rediscovered, how many more lie unseen? The ocean floor is vast, covering most of Earth, and in its shallows may rest settlements, camps, whole villages that were erased when the sea crept forward again. Could it be that entire chapters of our story are sealed beneath the waves, unreachable, slowly dissolving in saltwater silence? Stone can endure, but wood rots, cloth dissolves, memory fades. The ocean does not preserve with generosity. It preserves with cruelty, offering fragments while swallowing the whole. What we know of early humanity may only be the inland half of the tale, while the coastal half remains hidden, dissolved, unknowable, and the ocean is patient. Subduction zones pull seafloor into the depths, carrying away sediments, swallowing history into the mantle where heat erases it forever. What we lose to the sea is not only hidden but sometimes destroyed, pressed into stone, melted into magma, erased from every archive but the one written in absence. If there were civilizations before us, if there were experiments in thought and community that rose and fell before our time, could they have built along coastlines that no longer exist? Could their memory have slipped into the water, leaving nothing but a silence that feels too deep to question? When we look at the sea today, we see only its surface, its restless shimmer. But beneath it is a museum without labels, a library without books, shelves toppled, pages torn away. In shallow waters, divers sometimes find remnant spillers, walls, pavements carved by ancient hands. Off the coast of India, structures rest beneath the Gulf of Comat, their lines geometric, their arrangement too deliberate to be mere rock. In Japan, the Yanaguni Monument stirs debate, its terraces descending like a sunken staircase, weathered by millennia, but still suggesting intention. Are these the ruins of forgotten cultures, or simply the illusions of pattern-seeking eyes? Science leans toward caution, yet the questions linger. Not because we know, but because we cannot fully know. The sea is both eraser and mirror. It covers, it distorts, but it also reflects back at us our own fragility, our own impermanence. Just as the tide wipes away footprints from the sand, so too does the ocean wipe away the footprints of civilizations, leaving us to wonder if our own will one day be lost in the same way. What if everything we build along coasts today, our harbors, our cities, our shining towers, becomes the doggerlands of tomorrow, drowned under waters that will rise again as ice sheets melt, as climates shift, as entropy writes its slow script? Maybe what is happening now has happened many times before. Maybe the sea remembers, even if we do not. And so, the ocean holds us in a paradox. It hides the past, it threatens the present, it shapes the future. It humbles us with its scale and its silence. When we walk along its edge, we are standing on the border of memory and forgetting, looking out across a horizon that has swallowed more stories than we can imagine. Could it be that the greatest library of human history is already underwater, unlit, unread, unremembered? And yet, if the ocean can erase so much, swallowing entire landscapes and centuries of memory, what other forces of Earth might be erasing in silence, reshaping time itself in ways we have barely begun to see? And yet, if the ocean can erase so much, swallowing entire landscapes and centuries of memory, what other forces of Earth might be erasing in silence, reshaping time itself in ways we have barely begun to see? Imagine, for a moment, the future. Geologist sifting not through stone axes or shards of pottery, but through the remains of us. They would not find only bone and ash. They would find plastic hardened into strange layers, glass fused into sand, steel oxidized into scarlet crusts. Our mark would not be cave paintings, but polymers and alloys, materials that nature never knew until we summoned them. They would call them technofossils, artifacts of a species whose technology outlived its presence. Even if humanity vanished tomorrow, the traces would remain. Plastic bags and bottles would persist for centuries, perhaps millennia, drifting into sediment, pressed into rock. Aluminum, a metal rare in its pure form in nature, would become common in the record, a gleaming signal that something unusual once lived here. Concrete poured across continents would solidify into a layer as recognizable to distant eyes as any limestone or basalt. Nuclear isotopes, too, leave their fingerprints, particles that will hum within the Earth's strata for ages, marking the brief but unmistakable moment when we split the atom and let its fire loose upon the planet. But if our world leaves such enduring signals, then a quiet question rises. Could others have left theirs long before us, already erased by entropy, already swallowed by time? Could civilizations, not human but something older, have made their own technofossils, only to have them ground to dust, pulled beneath tectonic plates, recycled into magma where memory burns away? We like to think of ourselves as unique, the first to build cities, the first to make tools of steel, the first to light fire in circuits of silicon. But maybe not. Maybe intelligence is not a single event, but a recurring experiment, rising and falling across the epochs, its traces as fragile as any fossil shell. Consider how the Earth renews itself. Oceanic crust, young compared to continental stone, is pulled downward into trenches, carried into the mantle where all records dissolve. In 200 million years, almost all of today's seafloor will be gone, recycled, erased. Entire chapters of history, if they were written upon coastal plains or shallow seas, would be dragged under and lost forever. Even on land, erosion is relentless. Wind carves mountains, rivers grind valleys, glaciers scrape clean. Entropy is not a theory but a law, the steady unraveling of order into silence. Given millions of years, what would remain of us? A few bones in caves, a few fragments of tools, scattered and ambiguous. If another species were to rise in the far future and dig through the earth, would they find enough to know us at all? Or would they argue endlessly over whether intelligence had existed before them, never certain if their ancestors were truly alone? Perhaps this is already happening. Perhaps when we find a seam of coal, compressed forests of the Carboniferous, or veins of rare minerals layered in curious ways, we are glimpsing not only geology, but the echoes of forgotten experiments. Perhaps the isotopes we study, the chemical signals we measure, carry not just the memory of volcanic eruptions and shifting climates, but of something more deliberate, a footprint we do not yet recognize. Could technofossils have existed before, in forms unfamiliar, made from substances now untraceable? Could their remnants lie disguised as natural rock, their signal erased by the very processes that make Earth alive? Not because we know, but because we cannot know. The question remains. The fossil record is incomplete, always incomplete. Entire lineages of life appear and vanish with no warning. Entire ecosystems hinted at only by a fragment of bone, a ripple of trackway in hardened mud. If this much life can vanish, if this much history can dissolve, then why not civilizations too? Why not cultures, too fleeting, too fragile, their traces now folded into the silence of stone? And so the technofossil question lingers, unsettling, not in what it proves, but in what it refuses to dismiss. We may not be the first, we may not be the only, we may only be the latest ripple upon the surface of time, destined to fade as others have faded. The earth will keep its secrets, burying what it must, revealing only fragments, enough to tempt, never enough to satisfy. And yet, if even steel and glass can vanish in time, if entropy can grind our proudest creations into dust, then perhaps the only records left to us are not in stone, but in stories. And where do stories go when they survive the loss of memory, when they endure past the death of objects? Asterisk stories drift across the ages like smoke rising from forgotten fires, curling into shapes that linger long after the embers fade. Myths, legends, tales whispered in caves and sung in temples, carved into stone, carried across oceans. We often call them stories of gods, of giants, of lost lands. But what if they were more than that? What if they were not only creations of imagination, but echoes of memory, veiled in poetry, encrypted in the language of symbol and dream? When we hear of a flood that covered the world, or a mountain where fire dwelled, or a city that sank beneath the waves, it is easy to place them in the realm of fable. And yet, the earth itself has known floods and fires and the drowning of cities. The earth remembers in stone what human voices remember in myth. Is it possible that these tales are maps not drawn in ink or etched in coordinates, but mapped in the rhythms of story, pointing toward truths we only half recall? Consider the story of giants. Nearly every culture has them, beings who tower above mortals, beings who once walked among us. They are described as builders of walls, lifters of mountains, makers of the impossible. And science tells us that in the deep past there were indeed titans, megafauna, towering trees, immense reptiles, creatures so vast that they blurred the line between myth and reality. Could the idea of giants be an ancestral memory reshaped into human form, retold until the creatures of flesh became creatures of legend? Or is the myth itself another kind of fossil, a trace imprint of something once real, pressed into the sediment of collective memory? Then there are the gods, beings of sky, of sea, of underworld. We often imagine them as divine invention, but what if their stories were early attempts at geology, cosmology, meteorology? To the eyes of the ancients, a mountain that smokes and rumbles is alive, a god that breathes fire. A storm that splits the sky with light and sound must surely be a deity's voice. And the sea, restless, swallowing whole ships, consuming shores. Could it be anything less than the will of an immortal? Perhaps myths were the first textbooks written in metaphor, teaching generations about the dangerous rhythms of earth, about what to respect, what to fear, what to remember, and what of the drowned lands, the lost islands, the vanished continents. Atlantis in the west, Lemuria in the east, Hebrazel in the north. Everywhere, whispers of a land that slipped beneath the waves. We know that sea levels have risen and fallen, carving shorelines, erasing coasts, swallowing villages and plains. After the last ice age, entire worlds disappeared underwater, places where humans once walked. Perhaps the memory of these drownings endured not in precise maps, but in story, surviving the collapse of languages, the erasure of civilizations. Could it be that Atlantis is not one place, but many? That every culture remembered the loss of some homeland, and the only way to preserve the grief was to weave it into myth? To treat myths as maps is not to take them literally, but to see them as coded directions, pointing toward landscapes of history, both physical and psychological. A dragon sleeping under a mountain may be the memory of magma, of heat buried deep. Below, a tree that binds heaven and earth may recall the sight of towering forests stretching into the sky. A journey to the underworld may be the experience of caves, caverns, and the suffocating silence of the deep earth. Myths guide us, not through geography alone, but through the terrain of time, stitching together fragments of what was known, what was felt, what could never be forgotten. And yet, Myths also distort. They blur memory into dream, dream into warning. They warn us of repeating mistakes, of hubris, of loss. In every tale of a flood, there is a warning of balance. In every story of a fall from heaven, there is the shadow of human pride. They are maps, yes, but maps that remind us not only of where we have been, but of where we must tread carefully when we listen closely. Myths are not dead stories, not relics of superstition. They are echoes of a deeper voice, one that speaks across generations, carrying truths in disguise, waiting for us to decode them. Perhaps we will never know what exactly they mean. Perhaps they were never meant to be solved. Perhaps their beauty lies in their uncertainty, the way they hover between memory and imagination, between earth and dream, between what was and what could be. And if myths are maps, then they are maps that never end, always pointing further, always suggesting there is more hidden just beyond the horizon of knowing. And so we follow them into silence, into mystery, into the forgotten. And yet, if myths are this enduring, if they hold fragments of real worlds long lost, then what else might still be hidden in the silence of our collective memory? What other voices might whisper beneath the noise of history, waiting for us to hear them again? DNA is a library that never stops whispering. Its pages are thin, invisible, yet heavy with the weight of time. When we speak of history, we think of pyramids, stone ruins, broken tablets, but the oldest archive is not carved into rock. It is written inside the cells of our bodies. Every one of us is carrying fragments of beings who walked long before us, echoes of lives that no longer exist but refuse to vanish entirely. When scientists first pulled strands of ancient bone dust into a laboratory machine and read the sequence of Neanderthal DNA, it was as if the silence of caves finally spoke. They discovered that we are not purely Homo sapiens, not a clean line marching forward. We are a mosaic. Some of us carry 2% of Neanderthal code, others fragments of Denisovan bloodlines. All of us a quiet collage of forgotten lovers, brief encounters, and vanishing tribes. The mingling was not rare, was intimate, woven into the rhythm of survival. They loved, they fought, they raised children, and though their faces are gone, their instructions remain inside us, whispering, still. But what if the story is larger than the names we already know? For even with the Neanderthal and the Denisovan accounted for, there are gaps. There are genetic shadows that do not match any fossil we have ever found. Strands of DNA that appear as if from nowhere, as if another species, never yet unearthed, never yet named, pressed against us once, left its trace, and disappeared forever. Could it be that there were entire peoples who never left a skull, never left a tool, never left a grave we can recognize? Only a few silent signatures hidden in the double helix. What if our blood carries the memory of civilizations erased so completely that even stone cannot remember them? And yet DNA is imperfect as a historian. Time erodes it, just as wind erodes cliffs. Sequences rot, mutate, fragment. The code that survives inside us is only a thin thread of what once existed. How many stories are gone already? Not because they were never written, but because the ink has faded in the long stretch of millennia. In caves, we see drawings still intact after 30,000 years. In our bodies, the messages blur within just a few thousand. The irony is quiet but profound. The archive we carry is both the oldest and the most fragile, and still it speaks. Genes that once protected Neanderthals against bitter cold now shape our immune systems. Genes that once allowed Denise to breathe in the high, thin air of the Tibetan Plateau still linger in the lungs of people living there today. We carry survival mechanisms we do not remember earning, a body adapted to landscapes it no longer inhabits, a memory older than our minds. But how far back does this hidden story go? Before Neanderthal, before Denisovan, before anything we might call human DAWs, our DNA still carry whispers of even older kin. There are hints that it does, faint isotopes in the chain of inheritance, as though every generation is a palimpsest, every rewriting still marked by the ghost of an earlier script. We think of ourselves as singular, but in truth, we are a chorus. Every cell is a gathering, every breath is shared, and perhaps this is why memory itself feels so haunting. Why sometimes a landscape looks familiar, though we have never seen it. Why sometimes a silence feels inhabited, though no one is there. Perhaps in these moments we are brushing against the invisible archive inside us, the inheritance of unnamed encounters, the presence of lives erased from stone but preserved in blood. What if the greatest mysteries of humanity are not buried in caves or ocean floors, but inside ourselves? And what if the parts of us that we do not understand, the sudden flash of creativity, the instinct we cannot explain, the longing we cannot name, are the voices of lineages without language, speaking still through the chemistry of our being? The story of DNA is not finished, nor is it fully legible. It is like a book missing half its chapters, pages torn out, others burned, some ink smudged into unreadable stains. Yet, even in its incompleteness, it tells us one thing clearly: we have never been alone in our becoming. We are not one species, not one thread, but a woven fabric, a living museum of experiments and unions and disappearances. And yet, if this much can be found within us, if whole peoples can vanish from the earth, yet survive inside our blood, then what else might be hidden, waiting in silence for its moment to be revealed? The story of time on Earth has never been even, never been steady, never been a clock that ticks at a single pace. Sometimes the centuries drift as slowly as clouds over stone, and sometimes they rush forward as if the universe itself is leaning into a great descent. We think of time as a constant, a quiet metronome that carries us forward. But in the layers of the earth and in the long record of life, the rhythm falters. There are moments where everything seems to speed up. Whole continents shift their weight, climates collapse, oceans swell and retreat in pulses too sudden to call gentle. It is as if acceleration is written into the fabric of existence itself. The fossil record tells us this story more honestly than words can. For millions of years, life changes very little. The shells remain the same, the shapes of fish echo themselves. For eons, forests rise and fall in familiar cycles. And then, without warning, everything transforms in what geologists call punctuated equilibrium. Life holds steady until it doesn't, until it bursts forward in sudden waves of invention and disappearance. New forms emerge, old ones vanish, and the tree of life bends violently, as if time itself decided to rush its work. What could cause this? Was it a shift in the air, a surge in temperature, a hidden pattern in Earth's orbit, or simply the endless unpredictability of chance? Acceleration is not only written in fossils, but in stone. Look closely at the bands of rock, the quiet diaries of the seabed, and you will see eras that stretch thin, recording calm oceans and slow rains. Then you find sudden breaks, layers of ash from colossal eruptions, shocked quartz from impacts, isotopic spikes that speak of methane floods or abrupt warming. The Earth does not always move in whispers. Sometimes it shouts, and those shouts mark turning points, where the slow drift of geologic time collapses into a single violent moment. Yet, acceleration is not always destructive. There are moments when it is creative, when it seems to pull possibility forward before its time. The Cambrian explosion, for instance, where suddenly almost impossibly complex bodies bloom across the seas, eyes appear, shells harden, predators awaken, and in a blink, compared to the billions of years before, life invents an entirely new language of form. Why then? Why not earlier? Why does the universe wait until one particular threshold before everything leaps ahead? Perhaps acceleration is not random. Perhaps it comes when systems build tension, like a bowstring drawn too far until the release becomes inevitable. Ecosystems accumulate energy, atmospheres grow unstable, continents grind silently against one another until the pressure becomes unbearable. And then, the release, the cascade, the sudden unraveling that feels like speed, but is simply the hidden clock revealing itself. But maybe acceleration is only our perception. When we look back across deep time, our human eyes, so bound to a single lifetime, collapse the scales into what feels sudden. 1,000 years seems instant compared to 1,000,000,000, just as a century seems eternal to a single person. Could it be that there is no acceleration at all? Only the illusion created by the limits of our perception. Maybe the universe has always been steady, and it is we who see the world in pulses. Still, something in us recognizes the pattern, feels the rhythm of acceleration, even in our own story. Civilizations to linger in stillness for generations before bursting forward into invention and collapse. We see it in technology, in culture, in language, centuries of slowness, then decades of rushing change. Could it be that human history itself is only another echo of the same law that guides tectonic plates and galaxies? That acceleration, in the end, is not an exception but the rule of how complexity grows. And if acceleration is a rule, what does it mean for us now? We live in an age where change is constant, where the span of a single lifetime contains revolutions that once required millennia. Machines think, oceans rise, species vanish, skies warm, and it feels as though the bowstring has already been drawn, ready to release into a speed we can scarcely imagine. Is this acceleration natural, inevitable, or is it something we have written ourselves into by our own restless hands? Maybe acceleration is a kind of memory of the universe itself, a reminder that stillness is always temporary, that quiet epochs only set the stage for the sudden rush. Or perhaps it is the universe testing us, teaching us that nothing holds, that time is not steady, that the only constant is the breaking of constants. And yet, if the story of acceleration is woven into the very stones of the earth, if it is a law as old as oceans and as persistent as life, then we must ask, what is it accelerating toward? What threshold lies beyond the horizon of our knowing? And if all this rushing has already happened before, if countless worlds within hours have accelerated into birth and collapse, then perhaps the deeper mystery is not the speed itself, but the silence that follows it. Because if time can quicken, it can also fade. And if time has its surges, it has its falls. And maybe the greatest mystery of all is not how fast things change, but how quickly they are forgotten. And so, if acceleration tells us anything, it is that nothing remains still for long. And yet, as one age speeds to its end, another begins in the same breath, and perhaps that is where our story leads us next toward the spaces where endings and beginnings blur, where acceleration slows into memory, and memory dissolves into myth once more. They were small, so small it almost seemed like a trick of the imagination, barely over a meter tall, with skulls that could fit into the palm of a modern hand. And yet their bones told a story of fire, of tools, of persistence. On a remote island in Indonesia, in limestone caves that had held their silence for tens of thousands of years, the fossils of Homo floresiensis were uncovered. Scientists nicknamed them hobbits, not in mockery, but in awe, because these beings should not have existed, at least not so recently, not so fully formed. Not so human, and yet not human at all. The discovery shook our picture of ourselves, of the neat ladder we once thought evolution to be. For so long, we imagined a straight path, a single road leading from ape to man, from primitive to modern. But the bones in Liang Bua cave whispered something else, that the journey was never a straight line, but a tangled forest of branching paths, many of them ending in silence, some of them overlapping, some of them still waiting to be uncovered. The hobbits lived on Flora's island, perhaps until only 50,000 years ago, in the vast ocean of deep time that is almost yesterday. Modern Homo sapiens were already wandering the world, already painting on cave walls, already leaving footprints on distant shores, and somewhere, hidden in the shadows of tropical forests, another species of human persisted, smaller, fragile looking, yet capable of survival in ways we barely understand. Their existence forces a question: how many other kinds of us once walked the earth? How many bodies have crumbled into soil, leaving not a trace? Fossils are rare, born only under extraordinary conditions. For every skeleton that endures, countless others dissolve into nothingness. Could it be that whole civilizations of minds and hands, of stories and languages, once lived and died, vanishing without a single stone or tooth to tell us they were ever here? When we picture the hobbits, we imagine them crouched by a fire, eyes reflecting flames, hands grasping sharpened stones. Were they afraid of us, the taller beings who came later? Did they hide when they saw strangers on the horizon? Or did they never meet us at all, fading away before our paths could cross? There is no answer. There is only the ache of wondering. The island itself shaped them. Isolation has a strange power. Giant animals shrink, small ones grow. This evolutionary dance is called island dwarfism, and it sculpted these people into their miniature form, adapted perfectly to a world with scarce resources. They lived not as myths, but as flesh and breath, and yet they are now more ghost than fact. Fragments of a species that should not have survived as long as they did, but They did, and perhaps that is the most humbling truth of all, that what we think of as unlikely, as impossible, may in fact be only hidden. Every excavation, every brushstroke of a paleontologist's hand reveals not certainty but mystery. If the hobbits remained unknown until the 21st century, then what else might still be buried, waiting in stone and shadow? Maybe there were others, tiny, immense, fragile, strong beings that shaped fires of their own, carved tools, spoke words we will never hear. Maybe we are not the inevitable end of the human story, but only one surviving branch among countless broken ones. To think that our species alone was chosen is to forget how many others walked beside us, even if only for a little while. We call them the species that shouldn't exist, but perhaps that name is wrong. Perhaps it is not that they shouldn't exist, but that they remind us how fragile our ideas of existence truly are. If history can hide them for so long, then what else has it hidden? If a single cave can rewrite the story of what it means to be human, then how much of our story has already been erased? And this is where the silence grows heavy, because fossils are only survivors of chance, not keepers of the whole truth. For every bone that lasts, 1,000 more crumble to dust, swept away by rain, by fire, by the patient grinding of time. Even as we uncover what once lived, the earth itself is already forgetting. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Asterisk, everything fades with time. Rocks crumble, rivers shift, mountains wear down grain by grain. Even the hardest of substances, even the most carefully kept treasures, yield to the quiet pull of entropy. It is not destruction in the violent sense we imagine, but rather a long, soft unraveling, where the edges blur and the story slowly slips away. Bones that once held the weight of bodies dissolve into powder, and that powder is carried by wind, washed by rain, buried beneath layers that press and reshape them until no trace remains. What was once a skeleton becomes part of the soil, and what was once an artifact becomes a fragment, then a shard, then nothing at all. We might dig, we might search, but how much is already gone before our tools ever touch the earth? Entropy does not ask permission. It is the quiet law that guides all matter toward disorder, the hidden rhythm behind decay. Every fossil we hold in our hands is not just a clue, but also a reminder of everything that did not survive long enough to fossilize. Entire forests may have risen and fallen without leaving behind a single imprint. Civilizations may have carved their lives into wood, woven them into cloth, sung them into air, and all of it could vanish without even the ghost of a memory. We walk upon the surface of the planet and believe we know its story, yet most of its library has already burned in the fire of time. What if the greatest truths of our beginnings are already gone? What if the record of how consciousness arose, or how the first voices echoed in the dark, has been swallowed by the silence of entropy? We build museums and archives, and still the edges fray. Paper yellows, tapes fade, digital codes corrupt. We write, we carve, we inscribe, as if permanence can be wrestled into being. But permanence is an illusion. The earth is patient, and patience erases. And yet, forgetting has a strange beauty too. Without forgetting, there would be no room for new growth. Forests need fire, Fields need the turning of soil, and perhaps memory itself needs erasure to make space for the living moment. If every detail of the past survived intact, would we ever truly see the present? Or would we drown beneath the weight of infinite recollection? Maybe entropy is not only loss, but also the gentle hand that clears the canvas again and again. Still, there lingers a quiet ache in the thought of what we no longer hold. We imagine the voices of vanished people, their laughter rising into the night air. We picture animals whose bodies will never be reconstructed, whose patterns of movement and sound disappeared without a trace. We sense the landscapes that no longer exist, oceans that once covered mountains, deserts that once held rivers, and skies filled with colors we will never know. The earth has been so many places, worn so many faces, and we glimpse only the faintest outlines. Entropy is not cruel, but it is impartial. It reminds us that memory is fragile. Our own lives echo this truth. The way a face can blur in memory after years. The way the details of a voice slip away no matter how we try to hold them. Forgetting is not always chosen, and yet it comes. What does it mean, then, for a civilization to forget? For a species to lose its earliest stories? For the universe to allow its own secrets to scatter into dust? Perhaps the answer is not in fighting against forgetting, but in listening to it, in letting the silence speak as loudly as what remains. When we hold a fossil, it is not just the preserved bone that matters, but the hollow where countless others are absent. When we look at an artifact in a museum, it is not just the artifact itself, but the space of everything it does not tell us. Maybe the beauty of entropy is that it teaches humility, reminding us that the world is always more vast than the fragments we recover. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? What truths, what beginnings, what unimaginable possibilities might already be erased, waiting only in the echoes of silence? The earth does not only write its story in stones and bones. Sometimes the most enduring traces are whispers, so faint they are invisible to the naked eye, atoms with slightly different weights, isotopes suspended in minerals, ice, and shells, carrying with them the memory of vanished oceans, long-dead forests, and skies that no human ever breathed. These are not stories carved in monumental cliffs, but in the fragile balance of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. Each isotope holding a subtle clue to what life was like in an age no one remembers. A shell lifted from ancient limestone carries more than its curve and spiral. Within its calcium carbonate, the ratio of oxygen isotopes silently records the temperature of the seawater in which it grew. A fragment of coral holds the pulse of tropical warmth and storm. Layers of ice, buried deep in Greenland or Antarctica, preserve tiny bubbles of air from hundreds of thousands of years, trapped atmospheres that, when measured, revealed the rise and fall of carbon dioxide, the breath of Earth herself across the ages. What makes this strange is how such delicate signals endure when so much else has been erased. Whole forests have turned to coal, whole continents have drifted into the sea, and species have been lost without a single fossil. Yet, in the quietest of measures, fractions of isotopes, invisible patterns hidden within ordinary stone, we recover the rhythm of ancient rains, the seasons of vanished climates, the great oscillations between ice and warmth that shaped the path of evolution. It is as though the earth leaves behind not words, not images, but a faint chemical heartbeat that can still be heard if we are willing to listen slowly enough. Carbon isotopes, for instance, tell of life and death on a planetary scale. A sudden shift in their ratio in the rock record can mark a mass extinction when countless organisms perished and their remains altered the balance of the seas. Oxygen isotopes swing back and forth across epochs, revealing the breadth of glaciers. As they grow and retreat, even nitrogen, buried in the sediments of ancient lakes, speaks of fertility, drought, and collapse. To hold a piece of stone and know that within it lies the echo of vanished air that is to touch time in its most fragile form. And so scientists read these ratios, like monks poring over faded manuscripts. The data are numbers, yet behind them lies a poetry of climates, a story of extinctions and survivals. In isotope records, we find the fingerprint of volcanic eruptions, the scars of asteroid impacts, the slow chemical turning of oceans from life-rich to suffocating. We find the evidence of how fragile balance has always been, how delicate the thread between abundance and catastrophe. It is strange, almost unsettling, that such imperceptible details shape our deepest understanding of who we are. Without isotopes, much of our prehistory would be silent. We would not know when glaciers locked the world in ice, or when warmth returned to open corridors for human migration. We would not know how ancient droughts might have pressed early humans to move, adapt, or vanish. We would not know that entire species once thrived in climates utterly unlike today's. Isotopes do not shout, they do not demand attention. They are quiet witnesses, almost reluctant, their truth emerging only after patient listening. And yet, in their silence, they tell us that nothing is permanent. Climates swing, seas rise and fall. Carbon builds and disperses, oxygen shifts its balance, and with every turn, life is remade. To follow isotopes is to recognize that we, too, are suspended in their flow, our bodies made of carbon, our breath tied to oxygen, our fate entangled in ratios that seem abstract but are written into our blood. Could it be that we, in our own time, are leaving isotopic signatures for future beings to read? If ice and sediments survive, might someone far beyond us find in our chemical trace the mark of a civilization that burned ancient carbon too quickly, that altered the delicate balances in the air and sea? Perhaps they will hold a fragment of shell from our time and wonder what we thought, what we feared, what we chose not to see. The earth does not forget easily. Even when cities crumble, when languages vanish, when memories dissolve into silence, the isotopes remain, drifting quietly in stone, in ice, in bone. They are faint, almost ghostly, but they endure longer than we dare imagine. And yet, if such invisible traces can preserve the rhythm of vanished ages, what else might be hidden in the fabric of matter, waiting for discovery? What other secrets lie beneath our feet, waiting for those who know how to listen? Asterisk, asterisk, the stories whisper to us across time, carved into the clay of Sumer, sung in the chants of native nations, carried in the oral winds of distant islands. They speak of beings taller than trees, stronger than stone, who walked the earth before our small frames filled the land. Giants. Sometimes they were feared, sometimes revered, sometimes mourned as ancestors who had vanished, and even now their shadows linger at the edge of human imagination. Perhaps they were metaphors, a way for early peoples to measure the vastness of the unknown world around them. The thunder could become a giant's step, the mountain could be his spine, the valley a footprint pressed into the soft clay of a newborn earth. And yet there is something haunting in the persistence of these stories. Why do so many cultures, across oceans and continents, speak of the same colossal figures? Bones have been found, two mammoths, mastodons, the great ground sloths, towering species that humans once lived beside. To an untrained eye, a femur, the length of a man's body, might have been no beasts, but the remains of a forgotten race of giants. Maybe myths are not lies, but the blurred translations of memory, the way dreams turn waking hours into symbols we only half understand. A mammoth becomes a giant, a sloth becomes a guardian. A whale's skeleton pulled ashore becomes a ribcage of someone who towered over the sea. And maybe, when hunger and fear stalked the ancient tribes, these giants became stories of warning reminders that the earth had once belonged to beings greater than us, but the earth itself records its own versions of giants. Ancient trees, standing in petrified silence, their trunks wide enough to house whole families. Fungi networks that stretched across miles, invisible but immense, older than language itself. Dragonflies with wingspans, the length of hawks, moving through carbon-rich air that fed life into larger forms. The Age of Giants was not only a story, it was a reality, repeated again and again across epochs, a pattern written into evolution itself that life tends, for a while, toward enormity, before collapse and shrinking return. Is this why we dream of giants? Because deep in our blood we remember living in their shadows, and yet the mythic giants feel different, as though they belonged not only to bone and muscle, but to memory itself. The Bible spoke of Nephilim, offspring of heaven and earth, half mortal, half divine. The Greeks told of titans who built mountains with their hands. The Norse spoke of Jatun, looming figures born from ice and fire. Were these only mirrors of ourselves, made large to give scale to our own fears? Or were they echoes of something else, something that walked this planet in forms that memory cannot fully hold? Science reminds us that the human mind is a strange collector of shadows. A story told enough times becomes truth. A vision in dream becomes memory. A fossil misread becomes proof of something impossible. And yet, we hunger for these impossibilities, for the notion that the earth once held beings beyond our scale. We long to stand in the footprint of a giant and feel small again, to remember that the world was never built for us alone. What if the myths are half-truths, fragmented messages carried across millennia? Could the tales of giants be the distorted record of long-extinct hominids, larger and stronger than our own kind? Could the ghost of Gigantopithecus, the towering ape that once roamed Asia, survive in human whispers as the giant of the forest? Could memory itself act as a fossil, preserving not bone but story, not skeleton but song? Perhaps giants are not creatures at all, but memories made flesh, the embodiment of human awe when faced with a world too large to measure. The mountains, the oceans, the endless skies felt alive, all felt inhabited. To name them as giants was not to lie, but to honor their immensity. And in that naming, we carved our own place, small and fragile, against the canvas of enormity. Even now, when we read the clay tablets or listen to the old songs, there is a faint shiver, as if something inside us recognizes the stories not as inventions, but as inheritances. Maybe there were no giants in flesh, but perhaps the very earth was the giant, and the people who sang of them were only giving shape to its immensity. Or maybe there was once a time when humans looked up, and the world really was filled with forms that towered over them, creatures too vast to comprehend. We cannot know, but the myths remain, and they carry with them a strange humility, a reminder that our place here has always been small, and that something greater, whether beast, god, or stone, has always walked beside us. And if memory itself can preserve such shapes across time, then what other truths might be hiding in the dreams of our ancestors, waiting to be remembered? And yet, if this much can be half recalled, if giants of memory can persist in story long after their bones have turned to dust, then what else might we have remembered imperfectly? What else might we have mistaken for metaphor, when it was, perhaps, a fragment of forgotten reality? The earth has always been a quiet laboratory, its oceans and forests, its deserts and glaciers, vast rooms where life has been tested again and again, each species a tentative sketch in the margin of time. Some flourished, stretching into forms that endured for millions of years, their existence etched into stone and sediment. Others flickered briefly, brilliant for a heartbeat in the deep, then vanished, leaving only faint traces, isotopic whispers, and the soft erosion of their passing. Perhaps the fern that thrived when the continents were joined, or the amphibian that spanned oceans in the age of Pangaea, were once experiments, forgotten now, their brilliance turned to dust by the patient, indifferent clock of geology. And yet, if life could emerge, evolve, and disappear countless times before our own species ever drew breath, could it be that we are only one note in a symphony whose score has been mostly erased? Every fossil, every chemical trace preserved in rock is an argument with absence. We measure teeth, shells, and bones, trying to reconstruct the forms that time has undone. And sometimes, in the faintest isotopic signature, in the shadow of a vanished reef, we glimpse something extraordinary, a life that might have been, a branch that failed to continue, a possibility never fully realized. The earth was never limited to one design, one approach. Evolution is a tangle of trials, a forest of paths that fork and vanish, and we stand only at the edge of the paths that succeeded. But the paths that did not, do they linger in memory, in the molecules of soil, in the unseen structures beneath oceans, waiting for recognition? Could we, if we looked closely enough, see the ghosts of species that never left footprints in human consciousness, but whose brief flickers shaped the direction of life itself? The silence between species is almost as meaningful as the species themselves. The giant insects of the Carboniferous, the enormous marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, the small mammals that survived the last great extinction, they each tell a story, but they also ask one: what could have been, and what was erased by circumstances beyond comprehension? And in that erasure, is there a lesson about fragility, about contingency, about the arbitrary boundary between existence and oblivion? Perhaps nature has always been experimental, casting forth countless forms to see which endure. And each extinction is merely a page turned in a book whose narrative we can glimpse only in fragments. Maybe we survived not because we were stronger, or smarter, or faster, but because the world shaped itself in ways that favored this particular lineage, leaving all the others to dissolve into memory, to leave only subtle traces in DNA, in sediment, in the isotopes of rock. And yet, the vanished forms seem almost to whisper when we pause to look at the living, in the patterns of birds' flight, in the shapes of shells, in the skeletons that echo older designs. There are hints of experiments that worked for a time, and experiments that failed. Could it be that what we call normal is simply the last surviving possibility, the remainder of an immense catalog of life once tested across millions of years? If so, we are not exceptional, only persistent, the final branch in a tree whose many limbs were broken and lost, their stories hidden in the quiet decay of earth and stone. Perhaps other worlds, other lineages, once shared the planet with forms we will never know, beings whose lives might have been mirrored in our own but were erased by chance, by climate, by cataclysm, by entropy itself. Maybe life's experiments were never meant to be permanent. Maybe impermanence is the design, the rule of all things that breathe and move and vanish. And if we consider this, if we let the mind wander across the unseen experiments of nature, we begin to feel a humility that is both unsettling and tender, that our existence is a fleeting outcome, one among infinite trials, and that much of life's ingenuity, its complexity, and its wonder has already slipped beneath the soil, beneath the waves, beneath the forgetting. And yet, if this much can disappear and leave only a trace, a question, a shadow, then what else might still be hidden in the forgotten experiments that predated us, or ran alongside us, or vanished entirely without a record, awaiting rediscovery in the quiet spaces of the earth itself? Beneath the shadowed rock. In caverns where the air is still and the only sound is the slow drip of water, hands once pressed pigment to stone, leaving traces of life, of imagination, of a consciousness reaching outward into the void. The images are vivid yet delicate, the sweep of a bison's back, the arch of a horse in motion, the handprints of those who came before, pressed as if to say, I was here, I saw, I remember. And when we gaze upon them now, after tens of thousands of years, we feel a strange intimacy, a connection to minds that were both like ours and unlike ours, minds that shaped memory in pigment and shadow, minds that dared to make the invisible visible. Could it be that the spark of creativity was ours alone, kindled within our species for the first time? Or might it have been handed down from ancestors we have not yet discovered, whispers of cognition embedded in the lineages of beings whose bones have long since returned to dust? The walls of these caves hold more than images, they hold questions, frozen in mineral and shadow. Each curve of a line, each careful impression, seems deliberate, almost a language we have not yet learned to read. Perhaps they were maps of memory, guides for survival, or offerings to unseen forces that watched from the darkness. But perhaps they were simply the expression of curiosity, of wonder, of the unspoken dialogue between self and world. And yet, if these works of art emerged suddenly in the archaeological record, so sophisticated, so alive. What preceded them? What minds might have flickered and disappeared, leaving only echoes of their vision? Hints that human creativity is not a sudden spark, but the culmination of an inheritance whose origins stretch beyond our known history. It is remarkable to consider that these pigments, mixed from ochres, charcoals, and minerals, survived with such fidelity, while the people themselves vanished into time. The caves, cool and silent, became custodians of memory, guardians of something intimate and profound, preserving whispers of thought long after their creators were gone. Could we imagine the patience required to trace an image by flickering torchlight? To imagine a creature we had never seen, to capture the essence of motion, the energy of life on unyielding stone. And as we wonder, we realize that perhaps creativity is not only an individual act, but a current that flows through generations, across landscapes, across species, carrying fragments of understanding, fragments of experience, like sediment laid down layer by layer, invisible until the moment of recognition. Did other beings forgotten entirely paint in caves elsewhere, leaving traces that erosion and time have swallowed completely, their genius turned to dust before we could glimpse it? Could the act of making marks on stone be older than we think? A language of memory older than Homo sapiens, a signal from minds we cannot name, from lives we cannot trace. And yet, when we see the depth of these cave images, their clarity, their motion, their immediacy, we feel the same wonder as those who first held pigment and pressed hand to wall. And we are reminded that consciousness and creativity may have always been intertwined, always reaching for expression, always seeking to leave something behind in the quiet darkness. Maybe, perhaps, when we step away from the torchlight and let our gaze wander along the contours of these ancient walls, we sense the continuity of imagination itself, a current that flows from beings long gone to us, carrying fragments of thought, fragments of life, fragments of experience, as if to remind us that our capacity to wonder, to create, to imagine, is not only a gift but a memory, a lineage of the mind that persists even when the bodies that carried it have disappeared. And yet, if creativity can emerge, vanish, and leave only faint traces on rock and in pigment, what other knowledge, what other capacities might have been lost, waiting silently beneath the earth, waiting for someone to see, to feel, to remember? And yet, if the planet holds memory in stone and ice, it also bears the quiet scars of endings, of life erased with a permanence that leaves only whispers behind. Extinction is the slow folding of chapters, the closing of doors we cannot reopen, the soft vanishing of forms that once moved, thrived, and imagined. Each extinction event, from the great swaths of the Permian to the sudden flashes of meteor strikes, reshaped the tapestry of life in ways subtle and profound, leaving gaps, empty spaces that are never quite filled again. Could it be that among these voids lie species closely related to us, branches of humanity's broader family that flickered and disappeared before we could meet them, whose DNA might have lingered in faint traces in the quiet chemistry of the soil, in isotopes hidden within rock layers? Perhaps the earth remembers more than we do, and perhaps we only glimpse these absences as shadows, pale echoes of existence erased by forces too vast for comprehension. Rivers carve canyons over eons, and with them, fossils are exposed and carried away, fragments scattered like letters torn from a book whose story we can only imagine. The sediment of extinction is delicate. It preserves some forms and discards others, a partial archive of what was, leaving us to wonder if entire lineages have vanished without leaving a trace. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps the planet has swallowed some chapters completely, recycling life into new forms while erasing the old. A cycle we see reflected in the rise and fall of species. In the quiet disappearance of animals we will never know, in the sudden absence of forests that once covered continents. Could we, if we looked carefully enough, read the chemical signatures left behind in rocks, the isotopes that hint at massive die-offs, and reconstruct, in faint, speculative outlines, the beings who once shared this world with us? Extinctions are not always violent. Some are gradual whispers of disappearance that slip by unnoticed until the living landscape has changed irreversibly. Perhaps there were hominins, cousins to Homo sapiens, whose intelligence or culture never rose to the level we recognize, but whose presence might have subtly influenced the development of the world, whose traces linger faintly in our own DNA or in isotopic anomalies in cave sediments. Could these lost relatives have taught us things we will never know, left marks in our imagination without our awareness, shaped our very capacity for wonder? The silence they left is profound, a stillness that echoes across epochs, reminding us that memory is fragile and survival is capricious, that even beings as clever as we are can vanish without leaving a monument, a painting, or a tablet. And yet, extinction is not total annihilation, only transformation. Life continues, reshaping itself into forms we cannot anticipate, folding the past into new beginnings. Fossil layers, ice cores, and ocean sediments carry fragments of these lost worlds, tiny clues to the beings who have vanished. Perhaps every extinction is also a conservation, a quiet preservation of possibility, a hint that what seems gone may yet be glimpsed in shadow, in fragment, in DNA woven into the living descendants. Who survived? Could we, if we listened more carefully, sense the lost voices, the vanished footsteps, the absent shapes that once moved among forests, plains, and shores? And might these echoes tell us more about ourselves than the living alone ever could? Extinct is a teacher cloaked in stillness, a reminder that nothing lasts forever, that the history we inherit is incomplete, that time has swallowed whole lineages without ceremony. Each fossil, each isotopic anomaly, each sedimentary trace is a question, a soft prompt from the earth to imagine what was, to wonder at the forms that once breathed, and to feel the humility of knowing that life is not a ladder, but a vast, tangled network of emergence and disappearance, where the threads we see are only a fraction of the whole. And yet, if these echoes remain, faint though they may be, perhaps they are invitations, urging us to look deeper, to ask the quiet questions, to imagine the lost worlds whose memory lingers in the soil, the stone, the ice, and, perhaps, in ourselves. And yet, if echoes of extinction have vanished silently into rock and soil, another kind of emergence quietly reshaped the world, one that is less tangible but no less profound, the sudden flowering of language, of speech. Somewhere along the tangled paths of evolution, humans discovered the ability to shape air, to form symbols that carry thought across space and time, to transform internal wonder into shared understanding. It seems sudden, almost miraculous, as if one moment the world was a place of soundless gestures, and the next, a chorus of voices, carrying stories, warnings, and dreams. Could it be that this emergence was not entirely new, that something older lingered in our ancestors, waiting like embers beneath ash for a spark to awaken it? Perhaps the capacity for speech was seated in distant relatives, forgotten hominins, or even in the subtle rhythms of social life that left no trace except the resonance now alive in our throats and minds. Language is fragile, like a whisper across centuries. Words evaporate, dialects vanish, meanings shift, and yet the power to communicate persists, threading together generations, shaping the very way humans perceive the world. Could it be that the first utterances were more than survival tools, that they carried memory, encoding knowledge of landscapes, hunting strategies, or the shapes of constellations in ways no artifact could preserve? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps speech was an inheritance not just of biology, but of a collective imagination, a gift from those we cannot name, from lineages that vanished silently in the shadows of extinction, leaving only hints that resonate now in the patterns of our own language. Every word spoken is an echo, a trace of countless ancestors' minds, and perhaps within these echoes lie the faint signatures of beings whose voices we will never hear, shaping the thoughts that we take for granted. The emergence of speech reshaped culture, altered cognition, and allowed humans to bind together in ways unseen in the animal world. Storytelling, teaching, ceremonial became possible when sound could carry meaning, when the mind could externalize itself, and when communities could share not just action, but understanding, memory, and anticipation. Could this have been an accident, or is it possible that the universe itself had orchestrated this convergence, that the alignment of brain, tongue, and social need was inevitable? A hidden law of emergence, written in the chemistry of neurons and the physics of air. Every syllable we speak is a fragile monument, and yet its fragility does not diminish its permanence. Ideas persist long after the flesh and bones that first voiced them have returned to dust, encoded instead in the minds of those who follow. Perhaps there is an ancestral silence beneath every word, a quiet memory of lips that once moved in patterns, lost to time, of laughter, of warning calls, of songs we cannot decipher. Maybe speech was born from necessity, or from play, or from the yearning to be known and remembered. Maybe speech carried fragments of older intelligences, invisible lineages whose legacy now lives only in the sounds we make without thinking, in the structures of grammar and rhythm that no fossil could ever capture. Could it be that every conversation is a dance with this hidden past, that when we speak, we are brushing against the minds of beings who came before? Some close, some distant, all vanished, yet still present in resonance. And yet, the mystery of speech is not merely its origin, but its ongoing presence, its subtle shaping of thought and perception, its ability to create worlds and dissolve them again. Words are ephemeral, fragile, and yet persistent, like the faint traces of extinct species hidden in stone or ice, waiting to be deciphered by patient listeners. Each utterance is a question and an answer, a bridge between what was and what may be, and perhaps it carries a deeper inheritance than we can ever know. If speech emerged suddenly, could it also vanish, leaving only silence, leaving only the faintest echoes in the minds of those who remain? And yet, for now, it persists, delicate, mysterious, a living thread that binds us to the unseen, to the vanished, to the unfolding journey of humanity through time. And yet, if language carries echoes of ancestors whose voices have vanished, then perhaps stone, too, remembers in ways we cannot fully perceive. With intricate reliefs, silent sentinels that predate the histories we thought we understood. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record, their creators long gone, yet resist easy interpretation. Could these be the first deliberate constructions of civilization? The first attempt to bind community and cosmos together? Or are they the last lingering memory of a culture even older, a lineage whose knowledge and intent have been erased by time, leaving only whispers in stone? Perhaps monuments are never truly built. Perhaps they emerge from memory and imagination, solidifying dreams into tangible form, a language of shapes and spaces that cannot be spoken but can be felt, traced with eyes and fingers and quiet wonder. Tepe is both astonishing and confounding, its pillars rising 20 feet or more, carved with serpents, boars, birds, and abstract symbols, a vocabulary in stone whose grammar we may never fully learn. Could these images be sacred or playful, or both? Perhaps they are a map, not of geography, but of memory, marking places and ideas that were too fragile to survive in speech alone, encoded in durable limestone instead of ephemeral words. And yet, if such places could exist tens of thousands of years ago, what else might have been lost? Monuments swallowed by sand and soil, echoes of architecture and artistry that the earth has quietly erased. Every pillar, every carving, is a trace of intentionality, a fossil not of flesh but of thought, capturing the aspirations of humans who lived in a world only partially like ours, yet fully engaged in shaping the future, unknowingly leaving riddles for us to stumble upon in deep time. Perhaps the sudden appearance of such structures is less a surprise and more a reflection of forgetting the disappearance of earlier experiments in communal living in sacred space. In symbolic expression, layers of soil and sediment cover the ruins, and time has smoothed the edges of memory, leaving a palimpsest in which some messages survive and others are lost beyond recovery. Could it be that every megalith and every carved stone carries within it fragments of vanished worlds, hints of knowledge we cannot access, the shadow of intellects we have no name for, breathing quietly beneath the surface of human consciousness? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps the monuments we see are only the tips of a much larger iceberg of human endeavor, leaving their dreams in stone before vanishing into the silent archives of the earth. The act of building itself is transformative. To carve, to lift, to align massive stones with celestial events, or with the subtle rhythms of the seasons, is to engage in a dialogue with the cosmos, to leave a mark that persists far longer than individual lifetimes. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have known the magnitude of what they were doing, or were they following intuition, memory, and imagination, guided by a vision that was at once communal and personal, sacred and practical? Each stone stands as a question as much as an answer, a whisper across millennia that asks us to wonder, to imagine, to perceive the world not only as it is, but as it might have been, shaped by minds now invisible. And yet, if these monuments are dreams solidified, then all dreams are fragile, subject to erosion, subduction, and entropy, and much has surely been lost to the inexorable forces of the planet. Perhaps what we see is only a fragment of a conversation that stretched across centuries, a dialogue between humans and the universe, between intention and memory, between stone and silence. And perhaps in these silent dreams, encoded in patterns we cannot fully read, lie traces of civilizations older than history, older than writing, older than memory itself, offering us glimpses of creativity that is simultaneously ours and impossibly ancient. And yet, if this much can be preserved in stone, what else might still be hidden, awaiting rediscovery beneath layers of soil? As we stand on the fragile ridge of what we call progress, it is worth pausing to wonder whether the path we see was ever straight, or if it is only the illusion of survival that paints our lineage as inevitable. We imagine evolution as a ladder, each rung ascending toward complexity, toward consciousness, toward civilization. But the fossil record is more like a tangled thicket, each branch a story of experiments, many abandoned, many forgotten. Could it be that countless others reached similar heights, or different heights, only to vanish quietly beneath the slow accumulation of sediment and the inexorable grinding of countenance? Perhaps our triumphs are not the pinnacle, but the flukes that chance allowed to persist, the echoes of a much larger ensemble of possibilities now erased, leaving only fragments for us to stumble upon. Fragments we try to fit into a narrative of linear advancement, not because it is true, but because it comforts the mind to see order in the chaos of deep time. When we trace our lineage through bones and stone tools, we encounter hints of other beings, cousins of the mind and body, who may have spoken, laughed, and gazed at stars just as we do, yet whose names have been lost to the sediment, whose stories are buried beneath layers of earth that do not yield memory easily. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Flores, linger as a delicate whisper against the tide of extinction, reminding us that survival is rarely meritocratic, rarely fair, and often blind to intent or imagination. And yet, if mere chance determines which lineages persist, then progress is a mirage, a projection of meaning onto the slow, indifferent currents of time and environment. Perhaps what we call intelligence, ingenuity, and culture are not the inevitable outcomes of evolution, but the accidents of survival, glimpses into what might have been or what might still be hidden, waiting to be rediscovered in fossils, in isotopes, in sedimentary layers that record climates and catastrophes in the quiet language of chemistry. We measure ourselves against a timeline ice ages bury evidence, earthquakes crumble stone, rivers carve away monuments, and wind scatters the fragile artifacts of thought. Could it be that the universe holds within its archives entire civilizations we cannot even conceive of? Civilizations that thrived and vanished long before our kind could walk upright, whose traces are now encoded in mineral formations, fossilized, pollen, or shifts in atmospheric isotopes that whisper secrets we have not yet learned to read. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps progress is only a reflection, shimmering in the mind that seeks pattern, while evolution itself remains indifferent. a vast lottery in which survival is temporary and legacy is partial, and the illusion of direction is the only story that persists. And yet, there is a beauty in this uncertainty. To consider that we are not the apex, that other forms might have been, that countless variations of life have been tried and abandoned, is to see ourselves as part of a continuum, not as the conclusion. Every mutation, every adaptation, every fragile culture is a thread in a tapestry too vast to grasp, and the threads we perceive are simply those that remain long enough to leave a trace. Could it be that what we call civilization is only one flickering light in a constellation of experiments, a transient flare that may itself be swallowed by the slow, patient forces of entropy and geological transformation? And yet, if survival is fragile and fleeting, perhaps it is all the more precious, a reminder that our existence, precarious as it is, carries within it the memory of countless trials, the whispers of lives that might have been, the possibilities that the earth once entertained and then let vanish into quiet. Maybe evolution is not a climb but a meander, a river that twists and disappears, leaving oxbow lakes of memory in its wake, the remains of lineages that shimmer briefly in the light of discovery and then vanish beneath the sediment of time. And yet, if what we see is only one of many paths, what can we learn from the silent traces, from isotopes, from bones, from stone, from ice? Perhaps the mirage of progress is not a deception, but an invitation to wonder at the fragile improbability of our survival, to imagine the alternative lives that could have existed, and to consider that our story is not the summit, but a single branch trembling in the wind. And so we arrive at a quiet edge where the certainty of our identity begins to blur, where the stories we tell ourselves about who we are encounter the vast silence of what has been lost. Our bones carry whispers of ancestors we cannot name. Our DNA holds shadows of relatives whose faces we will never see. And yet we call ourselves human, certain in our continuity, even as the earth beneath us has rearranged itself countless times, erasing rivers, valleys, and even cities that might have held fragments of our beginning. Could it be that every name we give, every history we construct, is stitched together from shards of a memory that never belonged entirely to us? That we inherit pieces of stories interrupted by cataclysms, by the slow, patient work of entropy, by oceans swallowing landscapes whole? We like to think of identity as solid, yet it is more like sand slipping through fingers, every grain a possibility, every loss a quiet erasure. And perhaps the self we call I is nothing more than a temporary constellation in the night sky of all that once existed and is now gone. Perhaps, maybe, identity is always provisional, shaped as much by absence as by presence. Fossils reveal forms that might have been distant cousins, or entirely different species that walked the same earth, thinking, feeling, living in ways that parallel our own, yet vanished without record. Could it be that their absence has left a subtle imprint upon us, like a shadow in the genome, a whisper in the brain, a memory we cannot name? And if so, how much of ourselves is made from the silence of what no longer exists, the erasure of experiments nature once tried and discarded? Maybe, maybe not. The earth is a restless archivist, recording what it can in stone, in isotopes, in ice cores, and yet its memory is incomplete, selective, folded over by time itself, leaving gaps where civilizations, species, and ecosystems once flourished, leaving us to navigate a world that remembers only partially, that offers hints but never full stories. We seek our place in this patchwork, tracing lineages through fragmented bones, through linguistic echoes, through art and artifact. And yet, each discovery only deepens the sense of incompleteness, the quiet ache of what is missing. The temples we rebuild from shards, the skeletons we assemble from scattered remains, the genomes we map from broken strands, these are gestures of reclamation, attempts to hold on to identity before it slips entirely into the drift of forgetting. But perhaps identity itself is more like a reflection in water, shimmering and distorted, never fixed, dependent upon what remains above the surface, while the rest is hidden in currents we cannot see. Could it be that our sense of self is a kind of creative illusion, a reconstruction from fragments, not just of our own making, but of countless predecessors whose lives have dissolved into the sediment of time? And yet, there is a gentle beauty in this fragility, in the recognition that who we are is not absolute, that it trembles and flows, shaped by loss as much as by continuity, by absence as much as by presence. Perhaps the human story is not a single, unbroken line, but a mosaic of experiments, of attempts, of lives intersecting and vanishing, leaving only traces that hint at complexity we can no longer grasp fully. Each fragment we uncover is a whisper from the deep past, a reminder that identity is shared across time, across species, across the subtle, quiet processes that have sculpted life on this planet. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps to be human is to carry within ourselves the memory of absence, to recognize that the solid self we inhabit is always shadowed by what is missing, always shaped by the quiet erasures of deep time. And so we move forward, fragile and tentative, holding our stories lightly, aware that every certainty rests upon sediment and shadow. Our faces in mirrors, our names, our languages, our histories, they are all fragments, luminous but incomplete. And perhaps the truest understanding of identity is not in claiming what is whole, but in feeling the vast, gentle echo of what has been lost, and letting it shape us, softly, silently, like a river carving a canyon through stone over millennia, leaving only hints of its passage, leaving only fragments for us to recognize, to imagine, to wonder. And as we trace the delicate threads of our own minds, we come to the quietest, most elusive frontier, consciousness itself, that shimmering awareness that lets us know we are here, that allows us to wonder, to imagine, to remember, to feel. It is a fragile flame, flickering against the vast darkness of everything we do not know, a spark suspended in the currents of time. And yet it feels undeniable, immediate, miraculous. Could it be that this sense of self, this inner landscape of thought and sensation, did not begin with us at all, but is older, layered upon the earth through countless experiments of life, as if some aspect of awareness waited for the right body, the right brain, to awaken it fully? Perhaps consciousness did not emerge suddenly, like a single stone dropped into water, but rose slowly, imperceptibly, in a sequence of beings we will never know, their minds unrecorded, their presence vanished except for the faintest traces. In DNA, in the fossil record, in isotopes that hint at metabolism and behavior, patterns we can barely read, whispers of cognition almost entirely erased by time and entropy. We like to imagine consciousness as a pinnacle, a rare jewel of evolution. But what if it is a resonance, a condition of matter and energy that appears whenever complexity reaches a certain threshold and disappears just as easily, leaving no record? Could it be that for every mind that flourished and faded, the earth holds only shadows, echoes faint and fractured, faintly visible in the contours of bones, in the arrangement of tools, in the sudden leaps of culture, art, or language that seem to appear out of nowhere, as if memory itself were returning from a deep sleep? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps our own awareness is less a singular gift than a continuation of countless emergent phenomena, flickering in beings long gone, waiting for the right configuration of neurons, the right evolution of cognition, for a mind capable of asking questions about itself. And yet, we feel it now, undeniably, the intimate certainty of thought, the subtle pulse of awareness, and in this certainty lies both wonder and quiet despair. For the record of other minds, other experiments in perception, has been largely erased, leaving us alone to puzzle over origins and purpose. We can examine the traces, brain structures, preserved in fossilized skulls, isotopic signals hinting at diet and activity, social structures implied by habitation patterns, and the remnants of ritual or tool-making. Each hint suggests minds that once perceived, acted, and perhaps reflected, but we will never fully know their subjective experience. Did they dream as we do? Did they wonder at stars, or marvel at the flow of rivers, or feel the inexorable passing of seasons? Could it be that consciousness is not unique, but cyclical, a phenomenon that arises, vanishes, and perhaps arises again? A flickering current running through life's tangled forest of forms. And if so, what does that mean for the stories we tell ourselves about human uniqueness, about the sudden miracle of awareness appearing in Homo sapiens alone, as if everything before were merely preparation, a rehearsal for our minds to finally emerge fully formed? There is a quiet poetry in imagining consciousness as older than us, as a legacy inherited from forgotten beings, as a possibility embedded in the matter of life itself, waiting for conditions to awaken it fully. Perhaps the ability to reflect, to question, to perceive beauty or fear is not just ours, but an ancient inheritance we cannot trace completely, like footprints washed away by tides of deep time, leaving only impressions in sand we can barely read. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps, in contemplating our own awareness, we are glimpsing a history far older than the first humans, a lineage of perception that stretches back through countless forms, erased and remembered only faintly, like echoes traveling through the vast corridors of deep time, faint but persistent, shaping us subtly, invisibly, before we even existed. And so we live, aware of our thoughts, of our minds, of the miracle of perceiving ourselves, perceiving, and yet humbled by the realization that the continuity of consciousness may extend beyond us, beyond memory, beyond fossil and stone. Perhaps to understand ourselves fully, we must imagine the minds that came before, the fleeting sparks of awareness now vanished, and consider that the story of consciousness is a river with many tributaries, some lost, some merged into us, flowing silently beneath the surface of our knowing, shaping identity and wonder alike, and leaving open the question of who we truly are and what minds may have once walked the earth, leaving traces now almost imperceptible, yet somehow whispering to us across the vast, gentle currents of time. Asterisk. And so we arrive at the quiet aftermath, the world softened by time, where even the loudest histories have been reduced to whispers in the wind, and dust drifts over everything, settling slowly on bones, on stones, on ruins of cities that once hummed with life. In that delicate covering, there is a strange intimacy, a reminder that all things, no matter how grand or small, eventually yield to entropy, to the slow, patient work of wind and rain, of ice and gravity, until only the faintest traces remain. Perhaps this is the true archive of life, not the monuments we build or the stories we tell, but the sediment, the layers of earth that record quietly what we cannot remember, a memory written in sand and clay, in isotopes and fossils, in the subtle chemical traces left by beings who lived, who moved, who dreamed, now invisible to all but the most patient eyes. Could it be that in this soft erasure, in this covering of dust, there is a kind of honesty, a profound reflection of our own fragility, a mirror to the fleeting nature of identity, of consciousness, of civilization itself? We wander through the echoes, imagining streets once crowded, marketplaces alive with the rhythm of commerce, homes filled with conversation, laughter, argument, love. And yet, the dust is patient, impartial, and it erases not just what we build, but what we feel, what we think we know. The silence left behind is not absence, but presence in another form, a quiet testimony to the impermanence of everything we touch. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps every grain of dust carries a story, an energy, a subtle imprint of life that has long departed, waiting for someone to notice, to read the faint signals in the light and shadow, in the erosion of stone, in the subduction of oceans that bury continents and cities alike beneath layers of deep time. We are reminded that memory is fragile, that history is partial, that the line between presence and erasure is thinner than we imagine. And in this realization, wonder blooms quietly, like moss on forgotten walls, resilient and persistent, yet soft and yielding to the flow of time. The silence asks questions in its own way, questions that have no clear answers, questions that drift like pollen, settling lightly in the mind. Who were we before the stories we remember, before language, before monuments, before the flames of early fires? Could it be that many iterations of life, of mind, of civilization, have appeared and vanished without leaving a recognizable trace, leaving only isotopic signatures, faintly fossilized footprints, the chemical echoes of metabolism, the slow sediment of decay? We are left to wonder if our awareness, our identity, is itself layered over these forgotten histories, a continuation of processes that predate us by millions of years, a bridge built on unrecorded knowledge, on vanished lives, on silent lessons, embedded in stone and soil. And yet, if this much can vanish, if dust can reclaim the creations of entire species, how much of ourselves, of our understanding, of our consciousness is truly secure, and how much is already fading into the same quiet, patient erasure? Perhaps this is the paradox of existence, to live aware of impermanence, to build, to speak, to think, while knowing that every structure, every memory, every mark on the earth is destined to be softened, reshaped, absorbed back into the slow, inevitable processes of geology and decay. And still, in the dust and silence, there is an invitation, a gentle call to wonder, to pay attention to the faintest traces, to notice the patterns of erosion, the alignment of stones, the isotopic trails that hint, maybe, maybe not. Perhaps the dust itself is a kind of storyteller, telling us not what happened, but what matters, the ephemeral beauty of presence, the quiet persistence of life, even as forms vanish, the fragile, fleeting illumination of consciousness flickering in the vast expanse of time. And so we walk among the traces, aware that all things will eventually be reclaimed, aware that every creation, every identity, every civilization is subject to the patient hand of entropy, and yet moved by the gentle persistence of wonder, by the questions left behind, by the silent invitation to imagine, to listen, to feel, to inhabit a world where dust, silence, and memory meet, where the earth remembers in its own subtle ways, and where we, for just a moment, are awake to the fragile miracle of being, quietly drifting in the vast, patient sweep of deep time, and now. As the circle bends back toward its origin, we find ourselves at the quiet edge of understanding, where every question folds into another, where every story we tell is a thread in a tapestry whose edges we cannot see, and we are left to wonder what remains when all else is forgotten. Perhaps it is not monuments or fossils, not even the faint chemical traces locked in stone that define us, but something more subtle, more intimate, a resonance that lingers in the folds of time, whispering hints of what once was and might have been. Could it be that in the spaces between what we know and what has vanished, the essence of our being persists, not as facts or records, but as sensation, as awareness, as a gentle echo of presence that cannot be erased, even by the patient hand of entropy? We walk softly among the layers of earth and memory, feeling the weight of centuries pressing into sediment, into ice, into the very bones of the planet, and yet sensing that these traces, while fragile, are not empty. They are the faint pulse of continuity, a rhythm that bridges vanished civilizations and the brief flicker of our own conscious lives. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps what remains is not meant to be fully understood, only felt, a subtle vibration that stirs in us the realization that we are part of something older, something vast, whose history stretches beyond the limits of language or stone. We imagine the countless forms of life that have appeared and disappeared, the branches of evolution that never reached us, the silent experiments of nature that vanished before they could be noticed, and we wonder if consciousness itself is a gift inherited, a quiet spark rekindled again and again through the long, unrecorded corridors of time. Is it possible that our awareness, our sense of identity, is built upon foundations we cannot see, upon beings, thoughts, and lives that left no monuments, that left only subtle chemical or isotopic traces beneath shifting continents, beneath oceans that swallow history whole? And yet the beauty of this mystery is not in the certainty of knowledge, but in the delicate, almost imperceptible tension between knowing and not knowing, between presence and erasure, between the moments we touch and the eternity that stretches beyond our perception. Perhaps what endures is simpler than we imagine. Dust, silence, stone, and memory intertwine to form a network of continuity, a subtle archive written not in words, but in the persistence of matter, in the echoes of metabolism, in the faint, slow drift of isotopes through rock and soil, in the layers of ice that remember climates long gone. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps the true record of human evolution and of life itself is hidden in these quiet forms, in patterns that require patience to perceive, in stories that cannot be told aloud but can only be felt when we allow ourselves to pause, to breathe, to drift with the rhythms of the earth and the slow, inescapable sweep of time. What remains, then, may be as much the questions as the answers, the longing as much as the certainty, the awareness that every gesture, every thought, every life is both fleeting and enduring, fragile and resilient, erased and yet remembered in the most subtle ways as we move through the imagined ruins of forgotten epochs, listening to the wind sifting through ancient stones, to the quiet settling of dust over long-abandoned homes, to the faint chemical signatures preserved in rocks and oceans. We sense that identity itself is provisional, shaped by absence as much as by presence, by the lives that did not leave a mark as much as by those that did. Not because the past is incomplete, but because its incompleteness is the medium through which meaning can arise, through which consciousness can reflect on its own fleeting brilliance, and through which we can feel, for a fleeting moment, the full weight and wonder of having existed at all. And so we return to the question with which we began: who are we, really, if every trace of our story is subject to the patient erasure of time? If the monuments crumble, if the fossils dissolve, if the memory of civilizations sinks beneath oceans and sediment, perhaps the answer is not to be found in records or artifacts, but in the act of sensing, of imagining, of being aware that we are the inheritors of a mystery that stretches beyond our comprehension. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The silence between what is known and what is erased becomes itself a kind of revelation, a place where we can dwell briefly, and in that dwelling, perhaps, feel the profound, gentle miracle of consciousness, of memory, and of life, quietly persisting in the vast, patient sweep of deep time.